Well, good afternoon, good evening, and even good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Harry Brailsford with SMB Nation. We are in session 2 of our 6-part series, MSP Tech Talk. Totally appreciate your participation. We are overwhelmed and appreciate you jumping on board for spring semester as it was before we head into summer. And love the fact that you're affirming the format that we have of an hour a week with a variety of speakers and a variety of topics. Just to level set, last week we had a security lecture on bots primarily with a little bit of AI thrown in. That was a rodeo ride. And then today we have RDS with Windows Server 2016 that we're going to get to in a moment. A couple of scheduling updates that I will be at DattoCon. So I've been hearing from several of you, including those of you that live in Denver, Vince and Joe and some of the SMB Nation gang. We're going to get together. I'm coming in essentially Monday afternoon and headed out Thursday morning. So let me know if you're in Denver at DattoCon and want to get together for a coffee or a beer, or we'll see you in the hallways or something. Then WPC Inspire. And we're putting the final touches, and we're not quite ready to announce until we get our exact timings, but essentially the evening of July 9th, a Sunday evening, will be one of our famous beer fest. So if you're going to be in the Washington, D.C. area on July 9th, a Sunday, please pencil that in for the evening. We'll get you final details, but that's always really cool for people who are not attending WPC Inspire, and those that are, it's a chance to mingle, and also the traffic is pretty light. Then it's off to ChannelCon. Jenny and I will be there. An old friend of ours, Shauna, is going to help us out. That's in Austin on July 31st into July, first 2 days of August. CompTIA ChannelCon. So that's kind of the housekeeping for today that I always like to do up front. And be sure to use the questions feature to ask your questions. Jenny's in the control room and will be monitoring those, and I will be asking those of Grant. So without further ado, Grant, you're our longtime #1 speaker at SMB Nation, my friend. Look at this format. We're not on the road. We're online.
Oh, thanks, Harry. You know how the song goes. You're only missing home when you're on the road, and vice versa, right?
There you go.
There's something to be
Grant,
said.
Grant, introduce. A lot of people know you because you are our main speaker over the last couple of years. They've met you in person, but introduce yourself. Let's jump right into it. You know these people. They like the good stuff.
Sounds good. Thank you, Harry. First of all, I'd like to thank Harry, Jenny, SMB Nation for putting this on and giving me another opportunity to share with you folks, and also to Synnex for sponsoring this. Without sponsors, these things don't happen. So appreciate
Grant, if you don't mind, thank you very much. If you don't mind, I want to make a shout out to Synnex that folks, they have generously underwritten community content by design, and we need you to appreciate that. Thank you very much, Grant.
Yeah, no problem. So for those of you who don't know me, my name, as Harry said, is Grant Thompson, and I work for MG Technology Group. I'm one of the founding partners. Company's been around for just over 14 years. We had our 14th anniversary at the very beginning of this month, so that's pretty exciting. People talk about companies that were born in the cloud. We were doing cloud before cloud was called cloud, so I've been around this for a long time. Professionally, I have a lot of experience with Microsoft's platforms, everything from Windows Server, started with Windows NT4 way back in the day, and prior to that, other things like I remember installing Windows 3.1.1 off of the 14 floppies or however many there were. Some of you may have a copy of those laying around somewhere. I've worked with Office 365 and Azure since before they were released to the public back in late 2006 and 2007. Office 365, as many of you may know, started as the Business Productivity Online Suite, and Azure was essentially born around the same time because Office 365 actually runs on top of the Azure Fabric or infrastructure, as we call it. You can see on this slide here talking about our company. I also have experience with the Dynamics products, Dynamics CRM, and the ERP solutions, which have recently rebranded as Dynamics 365, just to confuse everybody. Exchange, SharePoint, Skype for Business, servers, high availability. I'm a solutions architect, so I do data center design all the way down to the hardware level for high availability, as well as familiar with technologies in Windows like clustering and load balancing and that sort of thing. My contact information is up here. Anybody who knows me knows that I'm a resource to the community, so feel free to reach out to me if you have questions that don't get answered today, things that are off topic. I'm happy to do my best to help out the community and other IT professionals, whether you're a Microsoft partner or an MSP or work for an internal IT department at your own organization. Today we're going to talk about remote desktop services. I'm going to cover some of the new things in Windows Server 2016. There's some pretty cool stuff, nothing major around remote desktop services, but some things that will save us some money, particularly with cloud deployment. And we'll talk a little bit about design, what some of the different designs look like, and we'll talk about pricing as well. If you have questions, there is a questions section inside your GoToMeeting. Please write those questions down. If I see something pop up, I may answer it during the presentation, but it's a little harder to do that for me versus an in-person event, so I may save all or most of the questions to the end. So we've allocated time for that, so be sure to stick around to hear the answers to those questions. Okay, we're going to dive right in here. First thing, let's set some baseline terminology. Again, I don't know what your background is, so if some of this is new to you, then hopefully we'll get you up to speed. If it's old hat, then this will just be a refresher in the beginning. So first thing we want to talk about is remote desktop services, and there's another term, remote apps. So what exactly is remote desktop services? Most people are familiar with the term remote desktop protocol, or we call it RDP, remoting into a machine or a server. Remote desktop protocol, RDP, is the underlying protocol technology that allows us to connect from one computer to another and see its screen, run applications on it. Remote desktop services, or RDS, which is primarily what we'll talk about today, is server technology that allows us to use a server to have multiple users log into that server and run applications independently of each other. So they have their own desktop, they have their own space inside that machine, so that we can have lots of users on the same server doing different things. Remote app was actually released in Windows Server 2008 R2, so many years ago. Still, a lot of people don't know it exists or haven't had any experience with it. It really is, in my opinion, the best user experience, end user experience for remote desktop services. And essentially what it does is, instead of having a window that is the remote server or remote machine you're connected to, where you have two start buttons and everything you do on that remote machine is contained inside of a single window, remote app uses the same technology but delivers the application windows directly to the user's PC. That makes the experience for them seamless. So the windows that they see, I'll talk a little bit about QuickBooks. It's a common application that gets thrown up into the cloud. Most people are familiar with it, but it really could be any application. So if we have QuickBooks running as a remote app, any windows that we open in QuickBooks will appear on our desktop or the user's desktop exactly the same way as if it was running locally on our own PC. In fact, it's so seamless, users often run into a problem. Maybe the application crashes or something happens and they essentially want to reset. We've taught them very well to reboot their computer, and so they reboot their computer, they launch the application again, and the error message just pops right back on their screen. And that's because obviously it's running on the remote server. So it's that seamless to the user. So we definitely recommend that people publish their applications as remote applications and use that as the means for the end user to access them. Next, let's talk about session-based versus virtual machine-based remote desktop services. A few years back, Microsoft enabled an alternate way of setting up remote desktop servers. Some people are familiar with the term VDI, or virtual desktop infrastructure. We're really not going to talk about that today. It's primarily for very large organizations in specific scenarios because it's quite pricey to deploy. But essentially, you have the option of doing session-based, where a single server is going to have a session for each user to run their applications in, versus virtual machine-based. What happens in that scenario is a user connects to the remote desktop services, and a virtual machine running a client OS like Windows 10 or Windows 7 is going to turn on for them, and they're going to be working inside that independent virtual machine. Again, this is more VDI or virtual desktop infrastructure. We're not going to talk about it. If you have questions about it or why it generally doesn't apply to smaller organizations, feel free to ask that question in the questions part or send me an email after the webinar is over. Our next term that we need to get inside our heads is remote desktop farm. If you've heard of the term server farm, essentially it's a group of servers, be they physical or virtual, that are all running in conjunction to provide a particular service. So a remote desktop farm, which we'll talk a lot about, is multiple servers all running to provide remote desktop services to our end users. Microsoft uses the term collection when they refer to a remote desktop farm. So if you're in Server Manager, for example, looking at remote desktop services, you will see the word collection, and in your mind you can translate that, if you like, to a server farm, which is a term that I'm more familiar with and more comfortable using versus collection. The next thing is service level agreement. Most people are familiar with this term. Unfortunately, I hear a lot of people, when they see service level agreement, they immediately go to talk about high availability. When they see a service level agreement, they think 3 nines, 5 nines, guaranteed uptime for a period of time, and really, service level agreement is a generic term that can apply to anything. For example, you might provide technical support to your customers and define a service level agreement. We're going to provide support 9 to 5, Monday through Friday. That's your service level agreement, and they're going to expect that any time during that stated hours and days that they're going to be able to receive support. If they call you on Saturday, there's no expectation that somebody will be there. Somebody else might provide a service level agreement around support that runs 24/7 with 15-minute response time. So you can define a service level agreement any way you want, but it doesn't necessarily, when we're talking about services like this, equate to high availability. Really what you need to do is work with your organization or your customer to define what they actually need, and that can significantly impact the design and their cost. Do they need these services available 100% of the time, or do they need these services only Monday through Friday, 9 to 5? Does it matter to them if their services go down for an hour, or is that something that's significant to them? So when we talk about high availability, what we're talking about is that 3 nines, 5 nines, 100%, whatever it is. We're talking about designing a solution that can withstand multiple failures or single failures depending on what our goals are there. And so we'll talk about that kind of design. I worked a few years ago with an escrow company on design for a solution similar to what we'll talk about today. And to them, if their solution were to go down, it had the potential of costing them hundreds of thousands of dollars in an hour because of the kind of business they were in. Large escrow company doing a lot of closings on commercial property. If their systems weren't available and they couldn't complete a closing, then they might lose that opportunity, lose that customer, and certainly they're going to lose face and trust with their customer base. And so for them, it was worth spending the extra money to do a very highly available design. For a small business who's, say, running QuickBooks and they need to get into it at the end of the day to type in the few transactions they did or something like that, high availability may not matter to them because they could always do it tomorrow, as long as they have protection, backup, and whatnot to recover from a failure. But that might not be as significant an impact to them. The next thing I'm going to go over are the various roles that are included in remote desktop services. So there are a number of components that we need to make a solution like this work. The first is the session host. I put the standard abbreviations for these on the slides to make it easy when we start looking at diagrams in a little bit. So the session host is where most of what we care about happens. That's where users actually connect to. That's where they're going to run their applications. And the session host's resources, CPU, memory, disk, network, all of those types of things are all going to be shared among all of the users that are on that particular server or servers. The next role we have is the remote desktop gateway. The gateway is very important because the port that remote desktop services uses by default is 3389. It's a well-known port. If you publish a server on 3389 to the internet, someone will try to hack it. You may have denial of service attacks on it. It really doesn't provide any significant protection from people gaining access to or attempting to gain access to your server or servers that are behind that. So the gateway provides a secure and encrypted buffer between the internet and our remote desktop services. So it's a very important role. And as we'll talk about in a little bit, it requires some resources. So if you're going to do large deployments where you have hundreds of users or thousands of users, for example, your gateway or gateways need to have sufficient resources to handle the traffic that's going on between the users and your farm. Yes, sir.
Yeah, Grant, an example that will resonate with this audience, and I'm going to get the port number wrong, but it's related to this. But back in the early days of Small Business Server, we had RWW, Remote Web Workplace, that was sort of a unique SBS feature. And I don't think it was 3389. It was some other port, which, boy, that book is packed away in mini storage. But basically what we were able to do is you could use a search engine and interrogate for that port number. So like Remote Web Workplace 9550 or whatever. And what it came back and did is it told you all these organizations that were running Small Business Server, because remember, that was a public-facing logon, and it was essentially remote desktop in one variation. And so what that could do is, if you were a vendor selling antivirus or something, you could interrogate the universe on that port number related to what you're talking about today, and then call the Seattle branch of the National MS Society and say, hey, do you want to buy some antivirus?
That's right. Yeah. So, it's just an interesting spin, port sniffing for marketing.
Yeah, exactly. Please continue.
All right, so the next role we have is RD Web, which ironically, if you haven't seen it in a while, it is very reminiscent of the SBS days. It's very similar, same kind of website,
there we go.
Same look and feel. So it's still there. And that allows people to log on, so it allows authentication and provides them a secure portal to go to see the applications that they can access. You can turn on or off remote app versus connecting to full remote desktop sessions where they have the start menu and all of that. Again, Microsoft and myself recommend remote app is the way to go for end users and only admins logging in using the full remote desktop. It also provides yes, sir.
Yeah, I'm going to keep interrupting you as I'm able, but Robert Rives has answered. It was port 4125. Thank you, Robert. I don't have to go to mini storage now. Thanks, Robert.
That's good. So we know we've got some veterans on the call here. The other thing RDWeb does is it provides a feed or a web service that since Windows 7 you can actually connect the remote apps to your start menu. A lot of people don't know that. It's very easy to do. The user can do it, just a few steps. And what that does is it provides a link on the start menu on Windows 7 and newer for all the applications that are published in the remote desktop farm or that particular collection. If you publish a new application that the user has access to, it will automatically be added to their start menu for them, so they don't have to do anything to gain access to that. As well as if you take away permissions or remove an application, then it will disappear from their start menu. Again, makes for a very seamless user experience so that they're not really aware that they're using cloud services versus something local on their machine. We got a couple more roles to cover here quickly. Connection broker, that is a service that maintains knowledge of what user is connected where. As we scale out, we'll have multiple session hosts, and if a user is connected, say, to server B, and there are 3 servers, A, B, and C, users on B, they get disconnected for some reason. They go to lunch, their day wraps up. If their session stays alive and they reconnect, we want to make sure that they reconnect to their session, so their applications they had open are right there waiting for them, and the connection broker is what handles that. It also handles load balancing. When we have multiple session hosts, we want to distribute our users across all of those, and that's what the connection broker does. I should point out the load balancing is not real intelligent. It's kind of traditional load balancing, what we call round robin. Essentially, it looks at the session hosts it has available, and it will just direct users to those servers and just go around in a circle. So the first user to log on goes to server A, the second one goes to B, the third to C. If those are all the servers we have, when the fourth one logs on, it'll put them back on one and repeat that process. It isn't real aware of how many users are on a particular server or how many resources they're using. So it's not looking and saying, oh, well, this server is really busy, so I'm going to put somebody on a different one. But it works very well. For the most part, people don't have issues like that unless they have some power users, and we will talk about a new feature in Windows Server 2016 that might be a solution for that. Next, we have our licensing server. Of course, with licensing for Microsoft Windows, there is a separate license for remote desktop services aside from the server license. I'm not going to go into the details of licensing in this webinar. We could probably do a whole webinar just on RDS licensing, but you want to make sure that you have the proper licensing, and that's going to vary whether you're in Microsoft Azure, whether you're doing this on premises, whether you're with a partner hoster. So you want to make sure to ask those questions and do your research, make sure you have the proper licensing for all of your users. One thing that's very different in the cloud is all users, for the most part, are named users. In other words, we don't have concurrent licensing with cloud anymore. And then finally, it's not a role, but we have a file server, and we'll see when we start looking at diagrams of designs that a file server comes into play, particularly as we scale out for storing things like user profile disks and other files that are common. It's just like we would have on premises. We're going to do the same thing in the cloud, have a place to store all their documents. Sometimes people ask me about SharePoint, one of my favorite Microsoft products. You can, of course, use SharePoint to store documents and other content. You cannot use it to store user profile disks. So, and we'll get into what those are and how they work in a little bit. So even when you scale out, even if all your company content is inside of SharePoint, you're still going to need a file server to hold user profile disks. Okay, let's jump into what's new in 2016. As I mentioned a moment ago, We really don't have load balancing that's going to force a particular user onto a particular server based on the resources that are used. In Windows Server 2016, there is now the concept of a personal session desktop. If you remember at the very beginning, I talked about the difference between session-based remote desktop as well as virtual machine-based or VDI-based remote desktop. This is sort of an in-between. We can essentially assign a user to a particular session host. It's server-based versus client. So again, on the virtual machine or VDI side, we'd be using the Windows client in the user's virtual machine, whereas in a session-based, they're running the server OS. So if we're deploying 2016, the user is going to be running their applications on Server 2016, not on a Windows client OS. So that's very important. Still true with personal session desktops. As I mentioned, you can assign users to a specific session host. This is very useful if you have a user who consumes an abnormal amount of resources. Maybe you have somebody who works in designing and running business intelligence reports or things of that nature. You could set aside a session host specifically for that user or a subset of users and assign them to that so that they're always going to be on that server and they aren't going to impact your other users and vice versa.
Grant, that sounds like there's a joke in here somewhere about that lead character Bachman on Silicon Valley on HBO. He's always bragging about his internet consumption. So there's a joke in here somewhere, but I wanted to provide a little context.
As always, Harry, as always. The personal session desktop settings are defined in the collection or the remote desktop farm settings. Most of them, the easiest way to configure that is through PowerShell. Of course, if you're not familiar with PowerShell, it's long overdue to get familiar with it and learn it and make it your friend. I was very reluctant, I'll be honest, to adopt PowerShell many years ago. Just one more thing to learn. Didn't seem like it was going to be all that useful. I have lots of scripts that I've written. Why do I need another scripting language? PowerShell is definitely my best friend and kind of the first place I go now in terms of my management and design toolkit. The other thing that's great about this is we can assign admin rights. Again, if we have a power user who needs elevated rights, we can specifically flag that user as having admin rights on the session host that they're getting logged on to give them that elevated privilege. There are some other really useful things in Windows Server 2016. There's lots of new technology in there. The UI is better. Obviously, we have Windows 10, the Windows 10 UI, so if users are using the full remote desktop, they're going to get that experience. The graphics are better. I'll mention a few other things, but again, we could do a whole webinar on just Windows Server 2016 and what's new in it. So if you haven't played with it, wholeheartedly encourage you to do so. One of the great ways to do that, if you're a Microsoft partner through Action Pack or your partner program, you can gain free access to some Azure services, so you can go spin up a 2016 server and play with it for a day or for an afternoon and see what's out there. Okay,
hey, Grant, if you don't mind, we're at the bottom of the hour, so I usually do a little bit of repeat housekeeping. I believe we'll hear from Synix at this time if you want to cue that up. And so folks, if you joined late, you're attending session number 2 of a 6-part series, an online educational series called MSP Tech Talk, graciously underwritten by Synix, and we appreciate their community support and supporting academic content. Very quickly, on the calendar front, next week, DataCon in Denver. I'll be there July 9th through 13th, WPC Inspire. I'll be there. We have a beer fest on the 9th if you want to join us. And then finally, in the near term, we have ChannelCon from CompTIA in Austin, July 31st through August 2nd down in Austin, and Jenny and I will be there. So Grant, I think are you holding the magic wand to play the video, my friend?
I am. If you don't mind, let me get through this last slide, and then
Okay.
we'll do our break. It'll take about 60 seconds.
No, that's absolutely fine. Go ahead.
So I just wanted to quickly review the last few things that are related to remote desktop services that are new in 2016. If you're familiar with Hyper-V, Microsoft's virtualization platform, there are two generations of virtual machines, Gen 1 and Gen 2. Prior to 2016, using Generation 2 VMs for the VM-based remote desktop was not supported. It is now. For those of you who use things like a Surface, I love my Surface and I love my Surface Pen. Pen remoting is now enabled in remote desktop for 2016. If you've tried it before, the pen actually worked, but now we have true pen functionality, things like pressure and whatnot. Before it was just treated like a mouse. We have Microsoft Edge support, which obviously is Microsoft's browser. I'll save people's opinion on whether they like it or don't like it, but now it's in Windows Server 2016, so users can leverage that. If you have users who need advanced graphics capability, Remote FX, which is some of the advanced graphics capabilities that came out in previous versions of Windows Server, now has OpenGL support. So if you have people doing AutoCAD, other types of real graphic intensive applications, we have better support or more advanced support for that. And multi-point services, which was a separate product, is now a role inside of Windows Server 2016. It's essentially a less expensive way of doing remote desktop services and some other things. We're not going to go into details on it. You can take a look at that on your own, or feel free to shoot me a question after the webinar. And finally, Microsoft has a remote desktop client application, the program you use to access all this stuff. There's one built into Windows 10 that's the same that we've always used. There is also a modern app that has a lot of nice features in it for Windows 10 that's been updated recently for 2016. You can find that in the Windows Store. There's an updated version for the Mac you can get in the iTunes Store. And then, of course, it's available for iOS, Android, and Windows Phone devices as well. Lastly, and we'll talk about this some more, the connection broker in 2016 can now use an Azure SQL database that is database as a service, and we'll talk about why that's important. That's a significant cost savings by allowing us not to have a full-blown SQL server or a SQL cluster to store the connection broker database, which is not a large database, and so that saves us a significant amount of money. Okay, thanks for letting me get through that, Harry. At this point, again, as I said in the beginning, sponsors like Synnex are what make these types of things possible, and they have provided a video for...
Pretty snappy video. Jeff, are you there? Jeff Rigsby.
I am. The video is a lot better with the sound.
There you go, my friend. I was rocking. I had to put my headphone on mute, and excuse me, Jeff, I'm fighting a little hay fever out here. Excuse
You're
me
fine.
if I cough. But what I wanted to do was just have a chit-chat with you. Jeff is from Synnex, and I guess if you don't mind, my first question is there's a lot of conversation surrounding the Cloud Advisor status converting to CSP. So maybe if you'd like to do the fastest 2 minutes in sports and hit that one head on.
Sure. So the Advisor program is Microsoft's oldest method of purchasing Office 365, Azure services, Dynamics. They've always given partners a back-end fee for selling the Advisor services directly through Microsoft, and they give the partners, Microsoft partners, a back-end fee for the sales that their customers are paying Microsoft directly for. The fees are going away in July. So no longer will partners who have customers that are paying Microsoft directly be able to obtain back-end fees or rebates from Microsoft. So the CSP program was created about 3 years ago, really took off about 2 years ago, but it was created for these partners to be able to take on these customers from the Advisor program, provide the services directly to them, provide management of those services, and bill and support the customers as well. So what Synnex is we're an indirect CSP partner, so we work through the channel, we work with partners who then work with their end users to provide Office 365, Dynamics, and Azure services.
Oh, there you go. There you go. And Jeff, you may have some talking points. One last question I have is where might people bump into Synnex at events in the next couple of months if they want to meet you?
Well, in the next couple of months, we're actually having a Azure practice development team training in Irvine, California. We did limit it to 40 people, so if you were one of those 40 people, congratulations, you're going to a great event. We will be at the Microsoft Inspire conference in Washington, D.C. in July. We'll have a booth set up. We're going to have a big party set up. We're doing some things with other vendors that we work with, like BitTitan, Skykick, Team Fusion, Service Points. A lot of those partners and other vendors are going to be there as well. So if you're going to be at the Inspire conference, make sure and stop by our booth, figure out how you as a partner can work with us, can work with our program to sell Office 365. We do more than just software sales. We provide third-party services that you can white label as your own. So if you've got a need for services that you don't necessarily provide, we can do those for you and do it as your company. So there's a lot of different things that we can provide outside of just, hey, we sell Microsoft. No, we do more than that.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Okay, any final? Oh, Timothy Quinn. Hang on a second.
Okay.
Timothy Quinn is asking for information on Inspire. Timothy, I'm about to hit send. I'm going to paste the URL for Microsoft Inspire. I'll also, Jenny, if you could make a note, I'm going to put that in the follow-up email, the thank you email. And then Timothy is asking for your last name and email address, if you don't mind, Jeff.
Sure. My last name is Rigsby, R-I-G-S-B-Y, and my email address is geoffr@synnex, and that's synnex.com. So
okay.
I spell my name a little differently.
No problem. My son spells his name the same way for Jeff.
There you go.
Any final talking point before we get back to Grant, my friend?
No, that's pretty much it. I wanted to make sure that everybody understood that we're an indirect CSP partner. We're a distribution partner. Traditionally, have always been in the hardware business, but over the last 7 years, have really picked up steam on the Microsoft side of the business. We're right behind Ingram and Tech Data. We're actually in front of Tech Data as it pertains to CSP. Still trying to catch Ingram though, but we're going to get there one of these days.
Okay, there you go. So we're going to go out with a quick poll, folks. Should be able to see that on the screen. Maybe Grant or Jeff, if you could let me know if you see that. The poll is: are you currently a Synnex customer?
And the reason that we're asking this is, we want to make sure that we're able to get in contact with those who are or who aren't. I want to make sure that I'm able to get my team involved with you as a partner, whether you're a Synnex customer or not, so that way we can at least have a conversation to figure out if there's anything we can do to help you guys move forward.
All right, and again, we appreciate your community support, and I mean that sincerely, Jeff, because not every sponsor understands that it's a little different to be a community sponsor when we're presenting academic content, which our audience appreciates, versus all too often a webinar can be a billboard advertisement for a sponsor. And I get that, and we try very hard to make sure we add value-added content, man.
I know you guys do, and we appreciate the work you do.
All right, back to Grant. Grant, go ahead and take presenter. The poll has been closed, and we're good to go. Thank you, Jeff.
Thank you.
Great. So just to confirm, my slides should be back on the screen.
Grant, I don't see it. Yeah, I don't see it, Grant.
Oh, there. Yep. Hang on. There it goes. It's thinking. And Jeff, just so you know, Jenny spent a couple hours on the phone with the GoToMeeting folks getting the video to play with audio.
Oh, nice. Well, thank you, Jenny, for the work. That it worked this time. And Grant, thanks for throwing it up there for me.
Yeah, no problem.
Did some heavy lifting. Grant, I'm still seeing the splash screen. Jeff, do you see? There's the slides.
We're good.
All right. Good.
Okay.
We're back.
All right. We're back. Okay, Grant, let her rip.
All right, excellent, thank you. So let's jump into design. As we go through the next few slides, I'm going to work these diagrams clockwise from the upper left around to the bottom, across the bottom from right to left, so you can follow along. Hopefully,
and can I ask if you to go in slideshow mode? I'm seeing edit mode in PowerPoint.
Are you now? Well, let's go.
If you don't mind being honest.
Yeah, no, that's good. We want the whole thing to show up here. So let's go from.
Okay, there's full edit mode, so you're back at full screen, and I think if you just kick out the screen on your lower right, over by the far lower right part of your screen, should put it right back in.
How's that?
There. Yep, we're there. Please continue.
All right, great. So again, I'm going to go clockwise from the upper left corner across the top down to the bottom, from right to left across the bottom. Hopefully you remember all the lovely acronyms, all the RDCB, LS. I'll try to point those out as we move along. These diagrams are built so that what's inside of the dashed boxes are virtual machines. Virtualization still confuses a lot of people. My easy answer for that is just forget about the word virtual. So we could be doing this with physical servers, in which case the dashed boxes would be a separate physical server. Same thing, we have a virtual network here in the middle. Just think of it like a network because it works the same. We don't really care whether it's physical or virtual. The functionality is identical. So in our upper left box, we have a virtual machine running the remote desktop connection broker and remote desktop licensing server roles. Again, the connection broker determines where users are directed to in terms of the session host. It does load balancing, reconnects users to existing sessions, things of that nature. We can combine those roles, and you'll see actually we can do this in a very compact footprint if we don't have a lot of users and don't need high availability. But this is kind of a standard non-highly available design where we have a connection broker and licensing server on a single machine, and then we have our gateway and our RD web on another machine. The reason that we want to put those roles separately is because the gateway requires a lot more resources than the connection broker and the licensing server do, so we can spend more money on the machine that the gateway is running on and use a much lighter machine for connection broker and licensing services. You'll notice connected to that out the top is our external load balancer. Whether we're in Microsoft Azure, partner-hosted environments, on-premise, there's going to be some type of external device, be it a full-blown load balancer, firewall, so that's where our connectivity to the internet comes in. And you'll notice, as I mentioned earlier, it's coming into RD Web and the gateway only, and so we're isolating all of the other services behind those two things, as well as behind our corporate or our environment firewalls. So then we go from the gateway down to the bottom in the lower right. We have remote desktop session host. We could have, in this case, we have two machines. So we have highly available session hosts, but that really doesn't do us any good if any of the other components fail because they're all single. And we might add those based specifically on resources. So even though this isn't a highly available design, we may have a number of users and need more resources in terms of CPU, memory, and whatnot, so we could add remote desktop session hosts. I don't know what the technical limit is, but it's a lot. It's probably anywhere from 16 to 64 session hosts in a single collection or farm. Then as we move to the middle along the bottom, we have a file server, and I mentioned this earlier. You'll notice at the bottom it says UDP, and that stands for UPD. UDP is a protocol. UPD is user profile disks. For those of you who've been around a while, one of the problems we had early on with remote desktop services or terminal services were related to user profiles, their settings, their wallpaper, their My Documents folders, all of those things. And so we had some kind of ugly tools like profile, roaming profiles and My Documents folder redirection. If you ever played with those, they were cumbersome to set up, cumbersome to manage, didn't always work the way we wanted them to. Microsoft has redesigned that, and so now we have this concept of user profile disks. It really spawned out of the virtualization boom, or the when that technology came available. Essentially what they do is create a hard disk, a virtual hard disk, that's stored on a file server, and when a user logs onto a session host, we're going to connect their little personal disk, their user profile disk, to that session host and load their profile. From there, we're going to wire up their My Documents and their Photos folder and all of that to that user profile disk. All happens behind the scenes at logon without any knowledge to the user. That way, when they sign out and sign into another machine, we just connect up that profile disk to the machine that they're now on, and all of their stuff is there. So we're not replicating or duplicating their documents or settings. We're simply moving them around with them. The best analogy I have is just imagine somebody's got a USB drive, and when they move to another workstation, they plug it in, and that contains all their My Documents and their settings and whatnot when they log in. And then they take it with them when they go to another machine, and so their experience is consistent. To do that, we need a file server or a file share, some place to put those user profile disks. By default, each profile disk is 10 gigs in size. It's dynamically expanding, so it only takes up the amount of space that the user actually uses. And you can control the size of that for the collection. So if you have users that need a lot more space, or they can make do with less, you could set that as appropriate inside of your farm or your collection. And then finally, in the far left corner on the bottom, we have Active Directory. Now, one of the things I don't like about this diagram, this is actually a Microsoft diagram, is that they have a single Active Directory server. Anybody in IT worth their salt knows that you never deploy Active Directory with a single server unless you're willing to risk Active Directory going away completely. Even restores of Active Directory, if you have a backup, are not as simple as they might seem, like restoring a file server, for example. So I would never recommend in production that you deploy this particular design where you have a single Active Directory server. So don't give me a hard time.
I saw people arrested, literally. Redmond Town Center, that bar, SMB Nation 07, the ruckus with the police over Active Directory on the SBS server. I mean, people got emotional. They went beyond emotional.
Well, I can imagine. It's definitely a touchy subject.
Yeah.
So let's
go on.
Let's look at another design. And so this design, we're looking at something that is highly available and taking advantage of some of the new features in Windows Server 2016. So again, we'll go around clockwise from the upper left. You'll notice for the most part, all we've done is duplicate our virtual machines. So now we have two VMs running the connection broker and the licensing service. That way, if one of those machines is off for maintenance or it fails, we still have our services required to allow users to log on. Then to the right of that, we have same thing, gateway server and RD Web running on two servers. There is some additional configuration that has to go on to make that work. You can't just spin up servers and duplicate them or install the same roles on it. You have to actually configure these things to work to be highly available, but it's not all that complicated to get them to do. When we dive into cost, you'll understand, how this drives cost up, because obviously we're doubling things that we need. In the lower right corner in this design, we still have only 2 remote desktop session hosts. Again, we could have more, 3, 4, 5. You don't have to have an even number of session hosts. You could have 3 or 4. They don't all have to be identical. They don't all have to have the same amount of CPU and RAM and storage and whatnot. They can meet your particular needs. So we see some people who will deploy high availability they have one remote desktop session host that is their primary, and then they have one that's kind of a fallback that has fewer resources on it. You can set inside of the load balancing settings for your remote desktop farm or your collection what the weight is for each of those session hosts. So if you have one that has, say, half the resources, you could give it a weight of 50%, and that way when the connection broker is assigning users to those, it will assign only half as many users to the smaller server. That way, if your primary goes down, you still have one, although it may be slow, but you still have one that users can leverage, and you can scale things based on users' actual needs. People ask me all the time, and when we get into pricing, this will probably come up as well. You know, how big should it be? How much RAM do I need per user? And the answer is it depends. It really depends on what a user's doing and what kind of applications they're running, what those applications are. I mentioned earlier, if you have somebody who's doing BI or they're running a lot of CPU-intensive reports, then obviously that user is going to need more resources than somebody who's, say, running QuickBooks or Word. Outlook is kind of a secret gotcha. If you don't have a lot of familiarity with remote desktop services, Outlook actually uses quite a bit of resources. It's kind of a resource hog in terms of applications. So if you're going to run Office in a farm like this, and they're going to use Outlook, then you want to allocate a little bit of additional RAM and CPU to that particular setup to your session host so that they have enough resources to run that application well. If they're only going to use it once in a while, maybe to send invoices out or something like that, not such a big deal. But if they're going to keep it running all the time and use this as a cloud-based desktop, for example, then you definitely want to allocate some more to that.
Hey, Grant, little bit of feedback for next time we have you on. When you say that people ask me all the time, I want you to do invention help, so the George Foreman ad. So we need to, let's work on, Grant, how do I? So I'll work with you in rehearsal on that one, because if people are asking you all the time, it sounds like a George Foreman ad. With that said, hey, Grant, in all seriousness, just to be mindful, we are approaching the top of the hour. We do continue in this format past the top of the hour, and there'll be ample time for questions at the end. So please use the question feature to start queuing up your questions. Go ahead, Grant.
Awesome. Thanks, Harry. So continuing along the bottom, again, we have file servers. Now we're doing those where we have two. In Windows Server 2012, Microsoft introduced the idea of a continuously available file share. If you're not familiar with it, look it up and learn about it. It's very easy to set up. And that means that if the file server that is holding, for example, a user profile disk dies, blue screens, powers off for some reason, the file is going to be open on the other server that is running, and so you're not going to have file corruption or user profile disk corruption, because as far as the user's concerned in their session, that connectivity is never broken. So very cool technology, very easy to set up, and you definitely want to enable that in this type of a scenario. Next over, you'll notice there's a SQL database. Since we have two connection brokers, we need to have a central external place to store the connection broker information. So that connection broker database would be stored on a SQL server. Prior to 2016, we had to have two SQL servers here. We would need two VMs. SQL servers also are resource hogs, so you needed some expensive virtual machines, plus SQL Server licensing on those to be able to run highly available or clustered SQL. In 2016, now we can use Azure's database as a service, and you'll see when we get into pricing here in a moment, saves us significantly. It's about $5 a month versus hundreds of dollars a month, so significant savings there. And then to the left, you'll see we have two virtual machines for Active Directory, and we're going to look at another option here in case we don't want to run our own Active Directory in the cloud. So this option, again, we're back to a non-highly available option, but the main thing to point out here is in the lower left corner, we have no more Active Directory servers. We've instead replaced it with Azure Active Directory Domain Services. Say that 10 times fast. So essentially what this is Microsoft has a service called Directory Services for Azure AD that allows us to use Microsoft's Active Directory, their identity provider, the same one that drives Office 365, to join these machines to a domain and allow for authentication and all of the things that we need to make all of this stuff work. And what happens when you subscribe to directory services for Azure AD, behind the scenes, Microsoft actually spins up 2 domain controllers for you. You don't ever see them. You don't have access to them. They're locked down and protected by Microsoft. But that allows you then to join these machines to the domain and meet all the requirements, again, saving a significant amount of money. If we were going to do this in high availability mode, Active Directory Domain Services is already highly available, so we only need that, and then we would just double up our connection broker, gateway, session hosts, and our file servers, and add in that Azure SQL database as a service. So again, we can save a significant amount of money by removing those domain controllers. Next is an example of partner-hosted. The examples, and I'll go a little bit into partner-hosted in terms of pricing. I'm using examples from our company, but there's lots of companies out there that do this, so you can talk to lots of different partners. They all have slight variations on how they deploy remote desktop services, so you want to check with them on licensing, check with them on roles, and what's available for them. But there are options out there. We see lots of customers who want to go to Microsoft Azure. We see some who just absolutely don't want to go to Microsoft or some of the other big players. This gives you, as a partner or as an organization, lots of options about going one place or the other. In this example, I've combined all of the roles, the connection broker, gateway, RD Web, and the session host onto a single server. We can do that. There's no technical requirement why we can't. Obviously, it's not truly considered highly available, because if this virtual machine were to die, then all of our services are offline. But it's a way that you can deploy it with significantly less cost, depending on what their SLA requirements are. You'll notice that the licensing server is also missing in this piece. And in the lower left corner, we have Partner AD. Many partners have their own Active Directory. It's different than Azure Active Directory, but works in somewhat the same way. They can provide highly available AD services for you to join machines to, saving you a significant amount of money, or your customer a significant amount of money. In our case, we also have licensing servers that are available, and so you don't have to run that role in the farm. In some cases, we can also provide the gateway as well, which, as I mentioned, is a resource-intensive, more resource-intensive role than some of the other roles, and so that can further reduce cost. The file server in this case would be optional. You don't have to use user profile disks, especially when you're in a single server. You don't have to put them on a separate file server. You could turn them on and have them stored on this one virtual machine if you wanted to. That makes scale out, where we add servers or enable high availability, a little bit easier because they're already, user profile disks are already set up. We're just going to move where they live. So lots of flexibility there. Office 365. If you thought you would get away from a webinar with me without talking about Office 365, well, too bad. Office is often required for application support. For example, QuickBooks, if you want to export to Excel, you need Excel on your session hosts. And the best way, easiest way to do that is through Office 365. The kicker is the licensing has to be Pro Plus, which means either standalone Pro Plus or the customer needs to have E3 or above. That's a Microsoft licensing requirement. There's no getting around it. That's just what you need to make it happen. Same thing on partner hosted as well as on Microsoft Azure. To use the Office applications on a shared computer, you have to be using Pro Plus, and that's remote desktop services as well as a server or a workstation. You know, if you work with auto shops or doctor's offices where multiple users are accessing the same workstation, their license for Office 365 has to be Pro Plus. If you're using a third-party hoster, they have to be approved for shared computer activation. This is a Microsoft requirement. One of the rules that they have for hosters that are approved for SCA is they have to have a page on their website with boilerplate Microsoft language on it. So if you're talking to a third-party hoster and you want to verify that they are authorized to do shared computer activation, ask them for the URL to the page on their website and just become slightly familiar with the language. It's all got to be the same for every hoster. They all have to publish the same page. And again, it has to be publicly available on their website to be part of the program. Finally, we have to use the Office deployment tool. If you're not familiar with it, it's a free download. There's great documentation on TechNet. The key is we have to install the Office applications using the Office deployment tool, and then here are the switches that you need to have inside the configuration file. Namely, shared computer licensing has to be one. That allows multiple Office 365 users to sign in individually and authenticate their license to run the applications properly on a remote desktop session host or a shared computer. Okay, let's talk about pricing. That's something that is very important to everybody. How much does all this stuff cost? Microsoft has a great pricing calculator for retail pricing. They just updated it not too long ago, so it's easier to use. It'll allow you to export a quote out to Excel or build something and then purchase right away. I put the URL in here. I believe the slides will be available for download after the webinar. At some point those will be published, but you can jot it down or screenshot it here if you like. So we have the pricing calculator. So let's talk about some of the different scenarios and what pricing would look like. This is retail pricing for Microsoft Azure. This would be for a single server. So this is one server that's going to run all of our necessary roles except for Active Directory. We're going to use Azure Active Directory and Azure Active Directory domain services for our solution. So you can see it's about $550 a month. Now, your mileage may vary because how many users you have and what kind of activity they're going to do on the server, how much storage you need is going to determine what machine or machines that you actually need to deploy. In this case, I've done a D3, which is a decent machine, 4 cores, 14 gigs of RAM, 200 gigs of storage. Keep in mind some of that's going to be taken up by Windows and the applications that you install. So, and then there's also the licensing piece that you need to consider. Again, we're leaving that out. I put at the top no support. Azure has different support options. They range from nothing, which is just billing support and really basic kind of community support, all the way up to $1,000 a month for their top tier support. Partner hosted, you're going to be looking at different options depending on the hosting provider that you're talking to. To give you a comparison, again, I'm using retail pricing from our company. You know, shop around, talk to lots of different people. There's hundreds of partner hosters out there. This is a very similar setup. You'll notice in the specs of the session host, it's a little bit different. This is one of our L2 machines. It has 12 gigs of RAM versus the 14 that we were just looking at, but it has an extra 50 gigs of storage included with it, whereas the D3 has 200 gigs of storage. You can see it's significantly less. It's about half the cost. This includes partner hosted Active Directory. There's no charge for that from us. And this also includes our technical support. So just to give you an idea, again, when you're looking at different partner hosters, they all do it a little bit differently. So you want to make sure to ask about support and ask about Active Directory and those types of things, as well as licensing and whatnot, to make sure that you have all your bases covered. The rest of this, I'm just going to talk strictly about Azure. You can see most of the partner hosters are going to be less expensive than Azure, but there's some pros and cons to which way you want to go, and that's going to depend on your requirements. So here we're looking at a small farm, not highly available. So we have, you'll notice we have single virtual machines for some of the roles here. And on the left-hand side, you'll see I have the roles listed out. The session host is the top one. The second one, we have 2 virtual machines, one for Active Directory, one running the connection broker and licensing server. That can be a significantly less powerful machine than a session host. Then the gateway is a bump up from there. We're up to a D2 to add some RAM and better processor. And then we have our file server for holding our data and our user profile disks. I picked this one because it's got 285 gigs of storage. There's a balance in Azure between compute power, RAM, and storage. And then obviously you can add storage onto those as needed. So you can play with that in the calculator based on your customer specific needs. So you can see here, this is still not highly available. Azure, in order to meet their high availability SLA to get their 99.9% uptime, you have to have 2 of everything. They're allowed to turn off a virtual machine, or if a virtual machine crashes, that the SLA is only enforceable if you have 2 of everything. So this would not qualify for that. But again, maybe your organization or customer doesn't need that, and so this would save them some money. Now let's talk about high availability. Again, we basically doubled our cost, but there are some differences. The first line, we have 2 session hosts. They, in this case, are identical. They don't have to be. That next line down, we have 4 virtual machines, 2 for connection broker and licensing services, 2 for Active Directory. Next line down, we have 2 servers doing the gateway and the web, and then 2 file servers. And I added in that Azure Database as a Service, a basic database for $5 a month to house the connection broker database for us. And I did not include any of the Microsoft additional support options. So now we're up to about $2,300 a month. We can drop some of that by removing Active Directory and replacing that with Azure Active Directory, save about $170 a month or so if we don't need our own Active Directory in the cloud. We want to leverage Azure's. That can also be useful because then their Office 365 account is their identity for signing into the remote desktop services farm. The other thing that we could look at doing in a case like this, oh, I lost my thought. Well, we talked about Azure Active Directory. That was just repeating myself.
Well, Grant, hey, if you don't mind, let me interrupt while you collect that thought. Folks, be sure to use the question feature to queue up your questions. I've got a really good one queued up. But continue, Grant, because we're going to take it to overtime. Oh, there's another question. Okay. Please continue, Grant.
So we're gonna wrap up. This is pretty much the last slide. A couple of other things I've mentioned, but you definitely want to consider. One is technical support. Depending on who you're working with, Azure partners, you want to ask what their level of support is, what the SLA for support is, what their response time is, if there's additional cost associated with that. And what their boundaries are. Some customers or companies will help you configure remote desktop farms so that you don't have to learn all of the nuances, and they'll work with you to get the design and deployment done. Others, you're just going to be on your own, so make sure to ask those questions. And the big one is backup. Obviously, we want to have backups of things. Some things may not need to be backed up. For example, you might have an environment where your session hosts are not backed up. Data is stored on a file server, that gets backed up, and you could actually store a template of the session host. So if one failed and you weren't able to recover that or didn't want to recover it, you could just spin up a brand new one, join it to the farm, and it would start servicing users right away. No need to restore from a backup in a case like that. So, but you definitely want to ask. Azure doesn't include backup by default. You have to add it on, so make sure that you do that. I did not put that in any of the pricing. You can also add your own third-party backup solution if you're comfortable using one of those or have a relationship with somebody already to those. And if you're working with partners, again, ask the same question. Do not assume they're backing up your data or your customer's data. And if you want to use a third-party backup solution, be sure to ask that that's supported as well. Thanks, everybody, for the time. And I know we have questions queuing up. Please use the questions area in the meeting to add those questions, and I'll stay on here to answer any questions that come up. Thanks very much.
Yeah, so Grant, can you see, because it'd probably be easier for you to read and answer as myself. Thomas Carroll wrote a fairly lengthy question. It's fine. It's actually 3 questions. Can you see that on your screen and tackle it from there, or would you like me to read you a bedtime story now?
Is that in the, I don't see it in the questions area, which I can see the questions area, but I don't see his questions.
Yeah, maybe break it out as a window. So in your dashboard, for GoToMeeting, you have the sort of a control panel dashboard, and one of the breakouts is questions. If you don't see it, why don't we start, and if that is visible, let me know. So Thomas Carroll asked, he says Office 365 Pro Plus on RDS. We have RDS 2016 in our office. I tried to install Office from the Microsoft partner Office 365, but RDS said not a valid version. Is that where the deployment tool comes in? Where would I find instructions? Thanks as always. Couple questions there.
So first of all, you want to make sure that whatever your Office 365 plan is includes Office 365 Pro Plus. So if you're on one of the business SKUs, that's not going to work. You need to be on one of the enterprise SKUs, like in the E3, or you need a standalone Pro Plus subscription. And yes, you can't install it from portal.office.com. You have to go to Microsoft.com and search for the Office deployment tool. There are 2 versions, one for Office 2013 and one for Office 2016. So you want to make sure you get the one that you want to install. And then there are instructions for it on TechNet. Just go up there and search for the Office deployment tool, and you'll find instructions. It's pretty simple. You're going to download the Office deployment tool. Once you unzip that file, you'll see a few files. One will be an XML configuration file, and one will be setup.exe. And essentially what you want to do is edit the configuration file. TechNet has the instructions in there for what all the different switches are, and you want to make sure to add the switches that I listed in my slide, particularly the shared computer licensing switch needs to be set to 1, and then you run setup and pass the configuration file to it. It will download all the bits and install Office on the machine, and then when users log in, and they try to launch an Office application, they'll be asked for their Office 365 login to authenticate that they have the appropriate license or subscription to run that app.
Okay, the next question we have is from James Page. James asked, do the pricing examples include the RDS connection licensing? Pricing examples include the RDS connections licensing.
Okay, and I can see the questions now. I was not looking at answered questions, and the ones you'd replied to were hidden. So in my examples for Azure, no, they don't include the remote desktop licensing, so you'd need to do that. In the partner-hosted example I gave, we do include remote desktop licensing. In that particular scenario, if you're flipping back through slides, that particular SKU includes 10 user licenses for remote desktop. And those are actually called CALs. You know, we're all familiar with the term CAL, Client Access License. In the hosting world, we work with CALs, which are subscriber access licenses, because they're month to month. One of the most important things is that they are not concurrent licenses. They are named user licenses when you're running in a cloud environment. So you need to have a license for every single named user, every person that's going to connect to that, versus having 10 licenses and 20 people and only 10 can connect at the same time.
There you go. Let's see, folks. Let's get those questions up. We have a little bit of a pause. While we're waiting for one or two more questions, I will again repeat the schedule that's coming up. So next week at DataCon in Denver, I look forward to seeing you there, July 9th through 13th, WPC Inspire. I have made a note to get, that's going to be in my thank you email tomorrow, along with the link to the replay of this, the deck, and so on, some other resources. So had a question about how to go to Inspire. You'll have that link in your inbox. Then we have July 31st through August 2nd at ChannelCon from CompTIA down in Austin. How about yourself, Grant? Anything on your travel schedule coming up, or is it more a case of if you come to Seattle, look up Grant?
Yeah, I don't have any current travel scheduled at the moment. I was thinking about going someplace sunny, but the sun came out in Seattle, so I'm going to hang out here for a while.
That's right. It's a beautiful afternoon. So, folks, I'm going to give it one last shot for questions. So, first call, and we'll take it up. It's like a charity auction going once. While we're doing that, Grant, I had a real reminder today, working around my yard briefly, and I took off Astro's invisible fence collar. Do not hold that collar in your hand with those prongs and walk around your property, because, boy, howdy, you'll know when you get up to that invisible fence.
Oh, boy.
Yeah, you'll know, so don't do that, folks. Looks like we're going twice and finally going 3 times. So sold to Grant Sinix, our sponsor, the attendees, and SMB Nation. Thank you very much for attending. Grant, thank you, for, as always, for being our lead instructor and really putting some meat on them bones. I know the audience appreciates that. Jenny over in the radio control room. Jenny, if you want to go ahead and take us out, and we'll all get back to work, and folks, you get an email to me for a thank you from me tomorrow. Have a great day.